All right, welcome back to the Talk to Me PDD podcast, where I talk about productivity, people management, leadership, and the role of AI in our modern working lives. Today, episode 25, we're going to talk about the hard thing about hard things. This is based on the book by Ben Horowitz, which I read recently and want to do a little bit of a deep dive. Hopefully, you'll take some of the ideas away, maybe go read it yourself. But either way, learn a little bit about kind of my thoughts on it and what you might find useful in your life. Now, this book was written from the perspective of a founder, a CEO, sort of an executive level. But I think there's so much value kind of in the intermediate layers there for those of us that are people managers, maybe not at the executive level, but still leading teams and managing people. And even just as individual contributors to understand sort of what are the best practice expectations, what you want to see, not just from your manager as an individual person, but kind of the organizational structure and how your company approaches leadership and management, and whether they're implementing some of these best practices or not. So let's get into it. Again, something I really enjoyed about Ben's perspective and his approach is his bringing his individual personality and his individual values into his writing and into his leadership. He's a big hip hop fan, so you'll get lots of hip hop lyrics there to start off each chapter. Now, whether DMX as a writer will stand the test of time, I think the jury is still out on. But again, I think it's really cool to incorporate that into your leadership. I think it makes you more authentic as a leader. And I think it just lets us bring more of our humanity into what we do, which in turn makes us better people leaders and better decision makers and more creative in many ways. So really enjoyed that part of it. Something that he calls out and something I've seen sometimes is the disconnect between what you see in a training perspective or even reading about management or leadership theory and what you see in the real world is there are hard things and there's not always a straightforward process that you can follow that's going to give you a perfect solution. So being comfortable and talking about living in this reality where you're not always making a decision that is easy and has an outcome that's perfect. So something he talks about is you have to focus as a leader on making decisions that may or may not have a great outcome. I think the natural human tendency is to run and hide from these situations or to try and avoid or put off making these decisions. And the mark of a good leader is that they're willing to take these decisions on. And they're often going to be difficult consequences or difficult things you have to do to make those choices. And there's not always a clear and easy right answer to make it as a leader. Something that he calls out that I hadn't really thought about, from his perspective, training is the leader or the manager's responsibility. So in a lot of organizations, you'll have separate learning or training organizations that will organize and handle and run trainings, which is great and valuable, but it sort of separates out the people who are actually doing the day-to-day work from those who are training. And this is true both in management and also in technical or subject matter areas that this approach can be taken. What Ben advocates is a more integrated approach where you're putting those who teach training up on a pedestal, and it's a position of respect that those who perform well have the honor of training and the responsibility of training new people in the organization. So even if you have the benefits of a separate training organization, think about how you as a manager or a team leader or a senior person on the team can take on that responsibility for training new people that come in onto the team and not just expecting that they're going to pick it up on their own or that it's somebody else's job, but it's a core responsibility of a leadership function to train new people coming in, whether it's on the culture or it's on more kind of tactical aspects of the job. A quote that I really liked from this book is, management purely by numbers is sort of like painting by numbers. It's strictly for amateurs. So while metrics, KPIs, OKRs, all these ways that management measures success are important, if you're only doing that, you're missing a lot of the big picture and being able to navigate in these gray areas, see business value in certain areas that may not be easy to measure or where there might be potential problems, or just sort of looking at the organization and the business more holistically is what you need to do to get beyond that sort of more amateur level of leadership and management. So I like that a lot. Kind of a scenario that he talked about that some managers or leaders might find themselves in, or maybe you find you're in this position as someone on a team, is where you have two competent leaders or managers. They may have complementary skills, so there's can be put into sort of a two in the box co-leadership type approach. And you could view this as, I get the best of both worlds. I have these different perspectives. His view on this is that it's really delaying making a tough decision because you're going to have to tell somebody they're not the leader if you pick one, and that may be difficult. They may choose to leave or have bad feelings or things like that. But by deferring that decision, you're then creating a lack of clarity on who's the decision maker. Everybody on the team has to get two perspectives. They may or may not align. So you're adding a lot of additional work and confusion to the team by delaying putting off that decision, which you're probably going to have to make anyway. So you should make it earlier on, even though it's maybe a difficult conversation or painful. There's a really interesting discussion around profanity in the workplace, which I thought was really interesting. One of the things I like about kind of Ben's approach in general is that he's willing to be self-critical and examine his perspective and other perspectives and realize that his perspective might be wrong or might be part of the problem. So he talks about a situation in one of the companies he was running, an engineering company, where a significant number of employees were complaining about sort of profanity in the workplace and that was creating an environment that they didn't feel comfortable working in. And Ben was one of the chief perpetrators of that profanity. And I appreciated that he took it seriously. He reviewed it. He thought about it. He sort of weighed both sides of things. So obviously it's important to have an inclusive environment where people feel comfortable. But for him, the trade-off was he wouldn't be able to recruit top engineering talent. And he wasn't able to have an environment that facilitated as direct communication. So he elected to keep profanity in the workplace, which didn't necessarily make everyone happy. And I'm not saying that's the right or wrong decision, but it was just interesting to see his decision-making process and thinking through where he was potentially, was part of the problem to a certain degree. So I think it's really interesting. That's not an environment that I am comfortable working in personally or really used to. But I think there are pros and cons to it. I think if you're in a very polite and nice environment, it can sometimes make it more challenging to give direct or critical feedback or move forward on things quickly. So I do appreciate sort of the upsides of what he's seeing in a more profane work environment, just not necessarily one that is my choice to work in. Something that he talks about, and I've talked about this previously, is sometimes you have to be careful as a manager about thinking out loud and how this can be different depending on sort of the seniority of the person that you're talking to. He talks about an employee asking for career advice, and with a more junior employee, just kind of being okay about thinking out loud. But as people get more senior, especially into the executive level, that even by sharing sort of helpful or sort of harmless thoughts that you might have, that can be taken and quickly turn into some sort of political situation, which I thought was really interesting. And I think it's important for all leaders to bear in mind that because of your position, your thoughts are taken seriously and with more weight than you might want them to be. So just being careful about how you share those things. And for him, kind of at the executive level of some of that things, it was almost like not having any reaction almost to some of these situations and more casual conversations that could potentially blow up into something that could cause problems that you don't need in your business and your organization. Talks about building systemic incentives towards the actions that you want. And people aren't entirely systems driven, but when your systems don't align with the actions and the behaviors that you want, it can be challenging to achieve them. And I think especially at an organizational level, you're going to see a lot of behavior based on the incentive systems that you have in place. And you often have to think past the kind of the most obvious into these second order effects of different systems that you can have and really carefully think through those because it may drive behavior that you didn't necessarily want and think about as a first order effect, but could be second or third order effects of the systems that you put in place. Talks a little bit about levels and having consistent leveling between different organizations. So, for example, if you had an engineering organization that was sort of at the the senior level of people, and then you have a marketing organization where everybody is a VP or a senior VP, that can sometimes cause confusion across those organizations about how much people are contributing and how sort of really senior they are or not, and taking those seriously. But it's an interesting discussion around levels and titles, and I've definitely seen people attach a lot of value to titles. His perspective a lot of the time was that it doesn't cost anything to give somebody a fancy title. So in some ways, if that motivates them, that can be good. But just bearing in mind sort of this consistency piece across organizations and whether that's going to cause confusion. Talks a lot about one-on-ones, which I think is great. I think that's a really important tool as a manager and as an employee. I've seen some people maybe say it's less important at the executive level, and I could see that being true. But I think for the majority of people, it's an important tool in sort of the management life and also just the functioning and health of the organization. A lot of what he writes about is based off the book High Output Management by Andrew Grove, which I'm reading now. I haven't gotten all the way through yet, but Grove also talks about the importance of one-on-ones in the manager sort of rhythm of life and business. And really thinking about that as 90% for the employee and 10% for the manager, and really a great opportunity to connect in and have a flow of information and clarity on expectations within those conversations. So great to see that called out as an important skill and function for managers to have. Talking about sort of at the CEO level, the importance of giving direct feedback and how that can feel really unnatural and uncomfortable, and sort of thinking about it as a CEO that being maybe disliked in the short term because you're having some of those direct conversations and giving direct feedback. But that's going to cause you to be a more successful CEO and for people to like you more in the longer term. So it's interesting to think about. I think the feedback is so important, and it is sort of delicate and maybe not in everyone's nature to be able to give that earlier on to allow people to take action on that. So I think that's something that makes sense at every level of management, to give that feedback as soon as you can, even though it may feel unnatural. So sort of a muscle and a practice that you have to build. And last but not least, he talks a lot about sort of his personal struggles as a CEO when he was going through difficult times in the business, how that affected him emotionally and internally, and how he wasn't really able to share that or get much public sympathy at the time. And I think that's great that he writes about that. I can imagine for other CEOs reading it who are sort of in the thick of it right now, that's comforting to know that they're not alone in the experience and sort of the struggles and second guessing sort of thing. Not to the same level, but I think that's true also just for anyone that manages or leads teams, that it can feel lonely, and sometimes there's sensitive things that happen or decisions that you wrestle with that weigh on you internally. So having, a network of peers or people you can connect with who've lived through those experiences, and just understanding that others have it as well, I think is really important for our well-being and not to burn out in the role. So there you go. Some takeaways from it. Go check it out. Great book. And I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on it. So take care.